The auction yard throbbed with noise, a restless energy that seemed to bounce between the wooden fences and dust-caked stalls. Men leaned against rails, their laughter rising above the calls of the auctioneer, while children darted underfoot, chasing each other with shrill cries. Horses shifted nervously in their pens, some with bright coats shining in the afternoon light, others gaunt and weary, their eyes dull with resignation. Amid this clamor stood a single animal who drew more ridicule than interest, a heavy-bodied horse, his flanks rounded with excess weight, his mane tangled, his once proud posture reduced to a sluggish slump. He breathed heavily, each exhale carrying the sound of strain, and when the sunlight struck him, the patches of dried mud only heightened his disheveled state. To the crowd, he was little more than a punchline, a creature whose worth had already been dismissed before the bidding even began. The auctioneer, a broad-shouldered man with a booming voice, leaned toward his microphone, eyeing the horse with a theatrical sneer. "Well, folks," he announced, dragging the word out to earn a chuckle, "here we have a real prize winner. Strong enough to eat through your grain in a week and lazy enough to nap the rest of the time." Laughter rippled through the crowd, quick and sharp. Some clapped their hands, others whistled mockingly, and the horse flinched, his ears pinning back against the barrage of scorn. A group of boys snickered, one pointing at the animal's swaying belly as if it were a carnival attraction. The auctioneer tapped his gavel impatiently, calling for bids with exaggerated sarcasm. "Do I hear 50? 40? Come now, surely someone needs a lawn ornament this fine." Eyes turned away, voices murmured, and one by one, shoulders shrugged in dismissal. No hand rose to claim the creature. For most, the thought of taking on an overweight horse seemed foolish, even reckless. Feed would be costly, training impossible, and what work could such a beast ever accomplish? The ridicule grew sharper in the silence, as though the crowd drew more satisfaction from his rejection than they ever would from his sale. Yet beneath the din, the horse's dark eyes told a quieter story. They carried the weight of humiliation, of knowing instinctively that he was unwanted, that he stood only as an object of laughter. His tail flicked once, not in annoyance, but in weary defeat. Amid the sea of dismissive faces stood a man who did not laugh, who did not turn away. His clothes were plain, worn at the seams, his boots coated in dust that matched the yard. He was neither tall nor commanding, but his presence was marked by a steady calmness, the kind that resisted the pull of the crowd's cruelty. His eyes lingered on the horse, tracing not the folds of flesh or the awkward stance, but the quiver of uncertainty in the animal's movements. He saw the way the horse's legs trembled, not only from the burden of weight, but from a deeper fear, the fear of abandonment. To the others, this was a beast past saving. To him, it was a creature carrying a story that deserved to be heard. The man's silence stretched long enough for the auctioneer to grow impatient. "No takers?" the booming voice barked, his tone teetering between irritation and mockery. "Not even for a bargain?" The crowd laughed again, louder, pressing the humiliation further. Still, the man did not move. His thoughts wove inward, to days when he too had been laughed at, when poverty had made him a target of scorn, when his own strength had been doubted by those with easier lives. The horse's plight stirred something in him that went beyond pity. It was recognition, a reflection of his own wounds. At last, he raised his hand. The movement was small, almost hesitant, but in the sudden hush that followed, it seemed to ring louder than any shout. Heads turned sharply, eyes narrowing with disbelief. A murmur spread like a ripple. Who would bid on that horse? Why waste money on dead weight? The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then grinned with sly amusement. "Ah, we've got ourselves a kind soul here. 50, do I hear 50? He waited, but no counterbids came. The crowd, content to jeer, had no interest in competing. 40 then. 30. Sold. The gavel slammed down, its crack echoing through the yard. The laughter swelled once more, not out of joy but out of derision for the man who had just bought ridicule in a halter. The man stepped forward, undeterred by the stares. He approached the horse with careful movements, avoiding the sudden grabs and loud commands others might have used. His hand reached out, fingers brushing the rough rope tied around the animal's neck. The horse shifted nervously, nostrils flaring, eyes darting as though bracing for another insult, another harsh tug. Instead, he heard only a low murmur, a whisper too soft for anyone else to catch. The words were gentle, lacking judgment, carrying the rhythm of reassurance. The horse's ears twitched, the tension in his muscles loosening just slightly, as though something in that tone defied the cruelty he had endured. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, laughter fading into murmured disbelief. Some shook their heads, muttering about wasted money, about foolish dreams. Others smirked, convinced the man had sealed his own humiliation. Yet the man paid no attention. His focus remained entirely on the horse, his hand steady on the rope, his voice calm in the face of skepticism. Step by cautious step, he guided the animal out of the ring, the noise of the auction growing distant behind them. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the ground, and the dust settled back into silence. The horse walked stiffly, uncertain of where he was being led, but there was no whip cracking, no mocking voice driving him forward. There was only the quiet presence of the man beside him, a presence that neither demanded nor condemned. For the first time in what felt like forever, the horse sensed something unfamiliar, hope, faint but undeniable. As they left the yard, the last fragments of laughter drifted after them, carried on the wind like echoes of a world that had already cast its judgment. The man did not look back. He had made his choice, one that defied the easy cruelty of the crowd. To him, the horse was not a burden but a beginning, a story waiting to be rewritten. And though neither knew the path ahead, though both carried scars the world had mocked, there was a quiet certainty forming between them. In that fragile bond lay the seed of transformation, one that no jeer or sneer could undo. The gavel's echo still lingered in memory, but as the horse lifted his head ever so slightly, his eyes meeting the man's with tentative trust, it became clear that what had been dismissed as foolishness was, in truth, the first step toward something extraordinary. The story had only just begun. The road stretched long and uneven, a ribbon of dirt lined with scraggly grass and broken fences. The horse trudged beside the man, his hooves stirring small puffs of dust that lingered in the fading light. Each step seemed heavy, not only from his bulk but from the weight of confusion. He had been led from ridicule into silence, and though the jeers of the crowd still echoed in his mind, the absence of cruelty felt strange, almost unsettling. The rope connecting him to the man hung loose, never yanked, never harshly pulled. It was an invitation, not a command. The man walked with steady purpose, his gait unhurried, as if he believed that time was no enemy. The evening sky deepened, streaked with crimson, and the first stars blinked faintly into being. For the horse, each breath still carried strain, but the quiet murmur of the man's voice beside him softened the ache. When they reached the small farmstead, the air shifted. The house was plain, its paint worn thin, its windows glowing with a modest warmth. A barn leaned slightly to one side, its wood weathered but sturdy. Beyond stretched a patchwork of fields, some alive with late crops, others bare and waiting for another season. It was no grand estate, no lush pasture of wealth, yet it was steady, lived in, and carrying the mark of a man who had worked with what little he had. The horse stopped at the edge of the yard, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring at unfamiliar scents. He expected impatience, a tug on the rope, a sharp word. None came. Instead, the man set down his worn satchel, patted the horse's shoulder, and whispered again, as though speaking to an old friend returned from a long journey. Guiding him into the barn was not simple. The horse balked at the threshold, eyes wide, hooves skittering backward against the dirt. Shadows inside loomed, and the stale scent of old hay stirred unease. The man did not force him. He stood quietly, waiting, one hand resting lightly against the horse's neck. The stillness stretched until at last the animal shifted forward, testing the ground, then stepping inside with a reluctant snort. The barn welcomed him with a hush, dust motes dancing in the last shaft of sunlight that broke through the cracks. The man led him to a clean stall, lined with fresh straw, and set a bucket of water nearby. The horse eyed it suspiciously before lowering his muzzle to drink, the cool taste easing the dry rasp in his throat. That night, the man lingered in the barn longer than necessary. He leaned against the stall door, watching the horse settle uneasily into the straw. His own memories tugged at him, of nights when he too had felt out of place, unwanted, judged by appearances rather than worth. The farm had once been alive with laughter, but loss had hollowed it, leaving silence that clung to every wall. As he watched the horse close his eyes in weary exhaustion, he felt the silence ease just a little, replaced by the sound of slow, steady breathing. It was not companionship yet, but it was a beginning. The days that followed moved with rhythm, though not without struggle. The horse was wary, flinching at sudden movements, refusing at times to leave the stall. His appetite was erratic, sometimes devouring feed with desperate hunger, other times turning his head away, as if weighed down by hopelessness. The man met each refusal with patience. He rose early, carrying water, scattering hay, speaking in that same low voice that never judged. He brushed the horse gently, working through the matted mane and the hardened clumps of dirt along his coat. At first, the horse resisted, shifting uneasily, but slowly he learned that the touch brought comfort rather than pain. Beneath the grime, patches of glossy hair began to emerge, faint hints of the strength hidden under years of neglect. Neighbors noticed. They leaned over fences, smirking as the man coaxed the reluctant horse into short walks across the field. "You'll break your back feeding that lump," one called, laughter riding his words. Another shook his head, muttering that no good would come of wasting time on a creature destined for nothing. Their words reached the man, but he did not answer. He had no interest in convincing them. The only conversation that mattered was the one carried in quiet touches and patient steps beside the horse. Trust grew slowly, marked by small victories that would have gone unnoticed to anyone else. The first time the horse nickered softly when the man entered the barn. The first time he allowed the rope to guide him without hesitation. The first time he lowered his head, leaning ever so slightly into the brush as it worked through his mane. Each of these moments carried weight, threads weaving into a fragile bond that deepened with each passing day. At night, the man sometimes spoke aloud. Words meant less for the horse's understanding than for the easing of his own solitude. He told stories of his youth, of days when the world had seemed sharper and less forgiving. He spoke of mistakes, of losses, of the people who had once laughed at him too. His voice would falter when he mentioned the horse he had owned long ago, a creature he had loved but could not save when hardship pressed too hard. The barn would hold his words in silence, but the horse's steady presence made the confessions bearable. It felt as though, in listening, the animal offered something no person ever had, unquestioning acceptance. One evening, after weeks of small steps, the man led the horse to the open pasture. The grass was sparse but soft beneath their feet, the horizon painted gold by the sinking sun. He released the rope, waiting to see what choice the animal would make. For a moment, the horse stood still, ears flicking, tail swishing. Then, with surprising energy, he trotted a short distance, his movements awkward yet spirited. The man's lips curved into a rare smile. It was not the grace of a racehorse, not the polished stride of champions, but it was freedom reclaimed in hesitant steps. Yet shadows of doubt lingered. The man knew the world beyond his farm was not forgiving. Already, neighbors questioned his sanity, ridiculing the effort he poured into what they called a lost cause. He also knew that patience alone would not erase years of neglect. The horse carried scars, both visible and hidden, and the road ahead would demand more than gentle words. Still, as the evening deepened and the horse returned to him willingly, lowering his head in trust, the man felt something stronger than doubt, a quiet resolve. The barn door closed softly behind them that night, shutting out the whispers of the world. Within those walls, man and horse stood not as the butt of a cruel joke, but as two beings bound by second chances. Their story was still fragile, still uncertain, but in the stillness of that moment, it held a promise neither ridicule nor hardship could erase. The laughter of the auction crowd might have branded them both as failures, but here, under the patient light of hope, a different truth was being written. The rhythm of their days began to shift, quiet patience giving way to steady progress. Each morning, the man rose before the sun, his boots crunching across dew-covered ground as he made his way to the barn. The horse would greet him now with a low rumble, no longer shrinking into the shadows, but stepping forward with tentative eagerness. Where once fear had lived in his eyes, there now flickered the beginnings of trust, fragile but real. The man carried feed, brushed down his coat, and led him into the pasture, where their work began. It was not the work of spectacle or speed, but of small, deliberate steps toward strength. The horse stumbled often at first, his body awkward, his muscles unaccustomed to discipline. When he tripped, when his bulk dragged him down, the jeers of the auction seemed to return like ghosts. Yet beside him, the man never raised a hand, never allowed frustration to harden his voice. "Easy now," he would say, steadying the rope with firm calm. "Not today, but tomorrow, yes." These words became a refrain, spoken softly yet carrying conviction, as though promising both himself and the horse that failure was only a pause, not an end. Weeks passed. The clumsy steps grew steadier, the breaths less labored, the movements more deliberate. The man guided him through short circuits of the pasture, then longer stretches, asking little but consistency. He taught the horse to carry light weight, not as a burden but as a symbol of progress. At first, the saddle seemed impossible, the straps pulling awkwardly, the horse shifting restlessly under its unfamiliar pressure. The man adjusted patiently, never forcing, waiting until the animal settled of his own accord. When at last the horse stood still, bearing the saddle without resistance, it was a victory greater than any applause. The neighbors, however, were less forgiving. They watched from the fence lines, arms crossed, their expressions filled with disbelief. Whispers carried on the wind, "He's wasting his time. That horse will never be more than a joke." Some were harsher, mocking openly, certain the man's stubbornness bordered on madness. Each laugh was a blade, but he did not let it cut. He kept his focus on the horse, on the rhythm of breath and step, on the quiet language that had grown between them. When ridicule grew loud, he only worked harder, as if to prove to himself and the animal that their worth was not measured by the voices of the crowd. At night, beneath the dim glow of a lantern, the man would sit outside the stall, his back resting against the wooden boards. He spoke less now, but when he did, his words carried weight. "I know what it feels like to be counted out," he murmured once, his voice rough with memory. "To have everyone look at you and see nothing worth saving. They laughed at me too. Still do." He paused, running his hand over the worn rope that tethered them together. "But I think, maybe, we can teach each other something." The horse, ears flicking toward him, lowered his head, the quiet gesture more eloquent than any reply. One afternoon, as summer tilted toward autumn, a flyer arrived at the small general store in town. It announced the county fair, boasting contests of strength, endurance, and skill. The man studied it silently, his weathered fingers tracing the words. He did not seek glory, yet the thought of leading the horse into a public test lodged in his mind. He knew what it would mean. Another round of ridicule, another chance for laughter to crush what they had built. But it also meant opportunity, the chance to show the horse, and perhaps himself, that dignity could be reclaimed. The decision weighed on him for days. At the barn, he found himself lingering, studying the horse's movements, gauging his growing resilience. He imagined the stares, the cruel remarks, the inevitable doubts. He remembered the sting of humiliation from years past, times when he had faltered under the gaze of others. To expose the horse to that same cruelty felt dangerous, almost cruel in itself. Yet each time he considered turning away, the image of the horse at the auction returned to him, broken, ridiculed, abandoned. If he had the courage to step forward once, could he not do so again? Training grew more deliberate after that. The man added small challenges, pulling light loads across the yard, navigating uneven ground, enduring longer hours of steady movement. The horse resisted at times, ears back, muscles trembling with effort, but the man's voice was always there, guiding, reassuring. And slowly, the resistance turned to determination. The once heavy steps grew lighter, the once sluggish movements more assured. It was not transformation in a single moment, but in countless repetitions, each one carving away doubt. Word of his intentions spread quickly. Neighbors laughed louder, shaking their heads. Some even placed wagers in jest, certain he would fail spectacularly. Children imitated the horse's plodding gait in mockery, while adults predicted disaster. Yet amid the scorn, there were also silent watchers, those who said nothing but returned each day to see how far the pair had come. Curiosity, reluctant though it was, began to mingle with skepticism. On the eve of the fair, the man stood in the barn, lantern casting long shadows across the walls. He brushed the horse with deliberate care, smoothing the coat until it shone faintly in the dim light. The horse stood quietly, no longer shrinking from touch, no longer restless beneath the saddle. His eyes met the man's, steady and unflinching. It was as if he understood that something awaited them, something beyond the borders of the pasture. The man rested his forehead briefly against the horse's neck, the gesture intimate in its simplicity. "They won't believe in you," he whispered. "They never will. But I do. That's enough." His voice caught slightly, but he did not waver. The horse shifted, exhaling a warm breath that brushed against him like an answer. That night, as the wind rustled through the trees and the barn settled into silence, both man and horse stood on the cusp of something greater. The world had mocked them, dismissed them, and doubted their worth. Yet tomorrow would bring a stage, a test, a chance not only to prove themselves, but to redefine what others believed possible. The man closed his eyes, listening to the horse's steady breathing, and felt resolve harden within him. The laughter of the crowd was waiting, sharp as ever, but so was the bond they had built, patient, resilient, unbreakable. And though the future carried uncertainty, the path forward was clear. Together, they would face it, not as objects of ridicule, but as companions bound by trust. The story of their journey was no longer just survival. It was becoming a defiance, a declaration that neither scorn nor failure would have the final word. The fairgrounds were alive with noise, a current of laughter, chatter, and anticipation weaving through the late afternoon air. Flags fluttered from tall poles, their colors snapping in the breeze, while the smell of roasted corn and fried dough drifted over the crowd. Families pressed close to the fences, children perched on shoulders to see the contests unfolding in the ring. Horses pranced with polished coats, their manes braided, their tack gleaming under the sunlight. Beside them stood owners dressed in neat attire, smiling with pride and confidence. And then, as though to invite ridicule once more, the man led his horse into view. The reaction was immediate. Gasps of disbelief gave way to bursts of laughter. Some pointed openly, others whispered behind raised hands, and the same cruel jokes that had echoed at the auction resurfaced here, sharpened by the spectacle of the day. "That's the one," someone jeered. "He'll collapse before the first turn." The horse shifted uneasily, ears twitching as if he could feel every insult sting against his hide. His steps faltered, the rhythm uncertain, until the man touched his neck lightly, steadying him with a voice too low for anyone else to hear. The words were simple. "It's just you and me. Forget the rest." They entered the arena. The contest was not one of speed or beauty, but of endurance, a trial meant to test strength, composure, and trust. A heavy sled laden with weight stood at the center, a challenge that would demand not just muscle but heart. The crowd leaned forward, eager to witness the humiliation they believed inevitable. The announcer gave the signal, and the man adjusted the harness with deliberate care. His hands moved with patience, his expression calm, though his heart thundered in his chest. When he finally stepped back, giving the horse the line to pull, silence fell for a breath. Then, with a deep exhale, the horse leaned forward. The first attempt was clumsy. The harness jerked, the sled barely budged, and the crowd erupted in laughter. Shouts rang out. "Give it up. Go home before you break him." The man's jaw tightened, but his eyes never left the horse. He stepped closer, speaking softly, the rhythm of his voice cutting through the noise. The horse's ears flicked back, listening. With another attempt, the muscles in his shoulders bunched, hooves dug into the earth, and the sled shifted an inch, then another. Gasps rippled through the jeering. The sound of straining leather filled the air, and though the effort seemed almost unbearable, the horse moved forward again, slow but steady. The laughter began to falter. What had seemed impossible was unfolding before their eyes. Each step carried the weight, not only of the sled, but of every insult, every dismissal, every shadow of doubt that had followed them since the auction. The man walked alongside, never pushing, only encouraging, his voice a constant thread of reassurance. The horse's sides heaved, sweat glistening on his coat, yet his eyes no longer wavered. Determination had replaced fear. Strength had risen where shame once lived. By the time they reached the marker at the far end of the ring, silence had overtaken the crowd. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then scattered clapping began, tentative at first, almost uncertain. But it grew, spreading like fire through the stands, until applause thundered from all sides. Children cheered, elders nodded with new respect, and those who had laughed now stood with mouths closed, their earlier mockery swallowed by awe. The horse stood tall, chest rising and falling, his ears pricked forward as though he too understood what he had accomplished. The man rested a hand against his neck, pride and relief softening his features. "You did it," he whispered. "You showed them all." The contest continued with others, but their performance lingered in the air like a story retold before it even ended. Strangers approached, offering handshakes, words of apology, and admiration. Yet the man accepted none of it with boast or arrogance. He smiled quietly, deflecting praise toward the horse, whose head lowered under gentle strokes. For him, the victory was not about proving the crowd wrong, but about proving to the horse, and perhaps to himself, that worth was never defined by laughter or scorn. As the sun dipped lower, casting the fairgrounds in golden light, they left the ring together. The horse walked with a new steadiness, his steps no longer hesitant, his head lifted just enough to suggest dignity restored. The man walked beside him, not leading, not driving, but simply sharing the path. They passed the same neighbors who had once doubted, their silence heavy with unspoken recognition. No words were needed. The change was written clearly in the bond between man and horse. The road home was quieter than the noise of the fair, but in that quiet lay a sense of triumph deeper than any cheer. The man glanced at the horse, watching the easy sway of his stride, and felt gratitude swell within him. It was not only the horse who had been redeemed that day. He too had carried the weight of ridicule, the sting of being underestimated, and in guiding the horse to this moment, he had also reclaimed part of himself. They were no longer broken fragments of laughter's cruelty. They were whole, together. Back at the farm, twilight settled gently across the fields. The barn welcomed them with the scent of hay and the soft rustle of straw. The man removed the harness, brushing down the horse until the sweat dried and his coat gleamed faintly in the lantern light. The horse stood still, eyes half closed, his body weary but unbowed. When the man set down the brush and leaned against his shoulder, the horse shifted slightly, pressing into him with quiet trust. It was not grand or dramatic, but it was the purest expression of the bond they had built, a bond forged not in spectacle, but in countless small acts of patience and faith. Outside, the world might forget, moving on to other contests, other stories. But within the walls of that barn, a truth remained unshakable. They had faced the laughter, the scorn, the doubt, and they had endured. More than endured, they had risen. The man looked into the horse's dark eyes and saw no trace of the shame that had once haunted them. In its place was a quiet pride, mirrored in his own heart. As the lantern flickered and the night deepened, the man whispered one final thought, not for the world, but for the companion who had walked this journey with him. "They laughed once," he said softly, "but they'll never laugh the same way again, because you've shown them what strength really looks like." The horse exhaled, warm breath stirring the air, and lowered his head in simple acknowledgement. And so their story found its peace, not in the roar of the crowd, but in the silence that followed, where trust and resilience spoke louder than any words. Tomorrow would bring new days, new work, perhaps even new trials. But tonight, under the watchful stars, man and horse stood together as proof that laughter could be silenced, that rejection could be rewritten, and that sometimes the most unlikely bond carried the power to leave the world in tears.